In a world where time is the ultimate punishment, some people serve as a testament to the strength of the human spirit. Some convicts have outlived the longest sentences in history, proving that resilience knows no bounds. Today, we will shine a light on the convicts who outlived the longest sentences and thrived against all odds. Michael Hamlin. In November 1978, a biker named G.T. McGarry disappeared from his home in Ventura County, California. A few days later, his body was found on the side of a frontage road about 25 to 30 miles from his home. He had been shot multiple times and was left there. Michael Hamlin was arrested and later found guilty of killing G.T., even though he protested his innocence during the trial. The DA's office asked the court for a secret hearing that Michael and his lawyer could not attend in order to protect an anonymous source. They were able to get the court to agree that important police reports could be kept secret at the start of the investigation. These reports showed that people other than Michael had admitted to committing the crime, but the police did not give these reports to Michael's lawyer. Hamlin's wrong conviction was finally overturned a year later. Michael was the person who had been kept in jail in California for the longest time without a good reason. David McCallum. A judge overturned a charge that put a man from Brooklyn in jail for 28 years. The charge was based on weak evidence, and 16-year-old David McCallum was sent to jail for kidnapping and murder he didn't conduct. At the time, Ronald Reagan was president, and a gallon of petrol cost 89 cents. After years of fighting for his freedom, which was helped by boxer Reuben "Hurricane" Carter, who was also wrongfully put in jail, McCallum was finally given a second chance at life. McCallum sat with his head on the table in front of him and didn't move while his lawyer Oscar Michelin rubbed his back. He looked very emotional after being locked up for so many years and then being freed. McCallum's lawyer sent Thompson a letter saying that neither McCallum's DNA nor handprints were found at the crime scene. This important clue led to his freedom. William Barnhouse. On April 21, 1992, William Barnhouse was arrested in Muncie, Indiana, behind an abandoned building on suspicion of raping a woman. He was found guilty in December of that same year. The police located Barnhouse soon after the incident and made him stand next to 3 police cars and several officers so they could check his ID. The victim was also present and recognized Barnhouse when the police shone flashlights in his face. Barnhouse claimed he had been falsely accused but was found guilty and sentenced to 80 years in prison. Finally, Barnhouse wrote a letter from prison to the Innocence Project requesting assistance with the wrongful conviction clinic at Indiana University McKinney. The Innocence Project requested that the sperm found on the victim's jeans and vaginal swabs be tested for male DNA. The Delaware County Prosecutor's Office agreed to the DNA testing. The sperm from the swabs and the sperm on the jeans both shared the same male DNA profile. Warren John. At the Iowa State Penitentiary Warren, an elderly man passed away shortly before Christmas in 2021. Jack Nutter, who was 84 years old, had spent the majority of his life behind bars. He had served 65 years in prison for the 1956 killing of a police officer in Independence, Ohio. Nutter had legal issues as early as age 14, making him the prisoner in Iowa with the longest jail sentence and among the longest-serving inmates nationwide. He and a few friends left their homes in Illinois in January 1956 and traveled to California. They robbed a store and stole an automobile before being apprehended in Buchanan County. During their attempt to flee, they fired another shot, killing a police officer. He was initially given the death penalty, but the governor commuted it to life in prison in 1957. When he passed away, he was just an elderly man in a new prison who had given up after being imprisoned for so long. In fact, his case was one of the reasons Iowa abolished the death penalty in 1965. Nevertheless, he was no longer a threat to society. Glen Ford. In 1984, Glen Ford was found guilty of murder and sent to Angola prison. 30 years later, in March 2014, he was finally found not guilty of any charges and freed. Ford was born in Shreveport, Louisiana. He is the person on death row in the U.S. who was cleared of all charges while still serving their sentence, and the state of Louisiana did not pay him a dime for being wrongfully convicted. On November 5, 1983, 58-year-old Isidore Roseman was discovered dead in his jewelry store. Roseman was killed by a single bullet to the back of the head. Several people at the trial said that Roseman's garden man, Glen Ford, was nearby when the murder happened. The jury found Ford guilty and sentenced him to death, even though there was no murder weapon or even any evidence from confidential sources linking him to the crime. Prosecutors took advantage of the defense's lack of experience and used a preemptive challenge to keep African Americans off the jury. In 2000, Ford went to court in Louisiana to say that the prosecution had hidden evidence that could have shown two other men were responsible for the murder. Eventually, they had to admit they were wrong and let Ford go after many years in one of the most notorious prisons in the United States. Anthony Sandborn. After a complex hearing spanning nearly 5 weeks, Anthony H. Sandborn Jr. was released in 2016 as a result of an unexpected agreement reached subsequent to his conviction for the murder of 16-year-old Jessica Briggs in 1989. Sandborn's attorneys have maintained his innocence, asserting that he was coerced into the case by prosecutors and police through the use of deceit, coercion, and threats against witnesses. Furthermore, they have alleged that evidence that could have strengthened Sam Sandborn's girlfriend since he was 16 years old, Briggs, was fatally stabbed and slashed, and her remains were dumped in Portland Harbor. Barbara Briggs, every day of the hearings, Jessica Briggs' stepmother, observed it from the first row of courtroom 8. She then briefly addressed reporters, stating, "We never had any doubt that he was responsible. Although our primary objective was not for him to walk away with the verdict, he remains culpable for the death of our daughter." The initial prosecution of Sandborn was founded upon rumors and lacked physical evidence linking him to the crime. The majority of the witnesses were adolescents who led a shabby existence on Portland streets, partying and bouncing from flat to flat in an attempt to evade the police. This case continues to be extremely controversial, but he is once again at liberty despite being technically guilty. Ricky Jackson. In 1975, while Ricky Jackson was a teen residing in Cleveland, Ohio, he was erroneously convicted and sentenced to death for the murder and robbery of Harold Franks, a money order salesman. Ricky and his co-defendants Wiley and Ronnie Bridgman were found guilty based solely on the coerced testimony of Eddie Vernon, a 13-year-old boy who later played a crucial role in acquitting the 3 men. Despite the absence of physical or forensic evidence linking any of the defendants to the crime and their prior criminal records, and despite the defense witnesses providing credible alibis for all 3, they were all sentenced to death within a few months. In 2011, Cleveland Scene magazine conducted an extensive examination of the case 36 years later. In doing so, the publication identified inconsistencies in young Eddie Vernon's testimony and concluded that no additional evidence connected the Bridgmans, Jackson, or any other individual to the crime, contrary to his request. Pastor Vernon retracted his stated account. Judge Richard Magongo granted the motions for a new trial in November 2014, dismissing the convictions of Ricky Jackson and Wiley Bergman. Although the charges against them were subsequently dismissed and they were released, a substantial portion of their lives had been tragically lost in such an unjust manner. Betty Smithy. After committing the murder of a child on New Year's Day in 1963, Betty Smithy was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She entered prison when she was a young woman, and she was released from prison in 2012. Due to her advanced age, she now walks with a cane from the time she was released. Governor Jan Brewer granted clemency to the woman who murdered infant Sandra Gerberick in 1963. After 2 prior governors denied her request, and she had been incarcerated for the longest period of time among women in the United States, members of Arizona's parole board agreed that she was no longer the same individual who committed the murder. Smithy is an individual classified as an old code lifer. She was sentenced to life in prison prior to 1973, necessitating a commutation from the governor in order to be released. Since 1989, only 3 of these lifers have been granted clemency. This development occurs nearly half a century after Smithy was convicted of the murder of Sandy Gerberink, one of 4 children she had been entrusted with as a live-in babysitter during the New Year's holiday in 1963. Sheldry Top. At the time that John F. Kennedy was President of the United States, Sheldry Top was only 17 years old when he murdered a man and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole in a county court in Michigan. In 2019, he was released from prison after having been incarcerated for over 56 years. To commemorate, he attended a steak dinner with his brother. Sheldry Top was the oldest juvenile lifer in Michigan. Top never attempted to overturn his conviction. Davis, who was 50 years old at the time, had, according to court documents, been admitted to and out of mental hospitals since he was 12 years old. He disclosed to law enforcement that he had sneaked out of a mental hospital in Pontiac, Michigan on the day of the murder. Doctors had recently administered electroshock therapy and hydrotherapy, in which patients are submerged in wet sheets and receive electric shocks. These treatments may have played a role in his altered mental state on that tragic day, which claimed the lives of him and his victims. Jess Pomeroy. During the Chronicles of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in December 1874, a jury in the Supreme Judicial Court of Suffolk County found Jesse Pomeroy guilty of first-degree murder. He was the youngest person ever convicted of the crime. Additionally, he may have been responsible for the deaths of multiple individuals between 1871 and 1872. While there have been speculations that an older child lured several young boys to remote locations where they were then attacked, no one has ever been incarcerated for the crimes. The attacks were significant because the perpetrator was particularly cruel and twisted. Pomeroy continued to assault young boys until he was apprehended and charged in juvenile court. Issuance by a judge subsequently, Pomeroy was convicted and enrolled in a state-run reformatory for boys in Westborough, Massachusetts. However, he was ultimately sentenced to death by hanging. In February 1875, Pomeroy's attorney, Charles Robinson, requested 2 exceptions, both of which were denied. It remained for the governor to sign the death warrant and determine the time of Pomeroy's execution. In contrast, Governor William Gaston declined to impose the death penalty on Pomeroy due to his juvenile age. As a result, he was admitted to Bridgewater Hospital for the Criminally Insane in 1929. There, on September 29, 1932, he passed away while in poor health. Randolph Arage. After spending years in prison for a crime that he did not commit, Randolph Arage was released in 2014 after repeatedly stabbing a woman whose body was discovered on a dirt road in rural North Texas. The woman's body was discovered lying on the road. At the beginning of the hearing, Arage had chains on his wrists and ankles. Later, 2 deputies took him into a back room and removed the chains. When Arage got home, he gave his 2 children a big hug. His daughter was 4 years old and his son was 7 years old when he went to prison. His children said that they never stopped believing in him and that they never thought that he was guilty. Arage was sentenced to 99 years in prison for the murder of Carolyn Armstrong in 1984. However, a state district judge in Corsicana, which is approximately 50 miles southeast of Dallas, agreed with the prosecution and Arage's attorneys that he could no longer be considered guilty. This was due to the fact that new DNA tests linked the crime to someone else. Juan Rivera. In the year 1992, Juan Rivera Jr., an American, was wrongfully convicted 3 times for the rape and murder of Holly Stalker, who was 11 years old in Waukegan, Illinois. He was convicted on the basis of a confession he claimed was coerced upon him. Furthermore, there was no evidence linking him to the crime scene. In 2015, Lake County, Illinois, awarded him the largest settlement of its kind in U.S. history, $20 million for his wrongful conviction. In 2004, DNA analysis of sperm collected at the crime scene determined that Rivera was not the source of the sample. However, the prosecution contended that the stalker had engaged in sexual activity and that the sperm sample originated from a time when she had consented to sexual relations with another man. As a result, Rivera was remanded to prison for the 3rd time. The Court of Appeals ultimately overturned his conviction. The double risk it poses clause prevented prosecutors from retrying Rivera because the court ruled that there was insufficient evidence to convict him the first time. As a result, this innocent man was finally released from prison after 20 long years. Otis Johnson. More than 40 years of Otis Johnson's life were spent in the prison. Convicted of attempted murder in 1975, he was apprehended at the age of 25 subsequent to an altercation with a police officer that transpired. This solitary action would profoundly transform the trajectory of his existence, propelling him into a realm of confinement, seclusion, and ultimately a reintegration into the community. Johnson experienced a surreal time capsule experience in prison, which immobilized his worldview from the mid-1970s onward. Upon venturing forth in 2014, he discovered a world that had been revolutionized by advancements in technology and societal transformation. Upon his initial encounter with the vibrant thoroughfares of New York City, he felt a sense of disorientation, as if he had entered a far-fetched future. Johnson encountered difficulty in grasping the swift progression of technology and the profound cultural transformations that had transpired throughout his absence. Performing mundane duties like utilizing a smartphone or navigating public transportation emerged as formidable challenges. In spite of the immense transformations, Johnson maintained his resilience. With the assistance of organizations committed to assisting formerly incarcerated individuals in reintegrating into society, he reconstructed his life incrementally. With a resolute intention of cultivating a personal growth and changing image, he secured employment, established fresh connections, and initiated an intellectual voyage. Joseph Sledge. The bodies of Aileen Davis, 57, and her mother, Josephine Davis, 74, were discovered beaten and stabbed to death in their Elizabethtown, North Carolina residence on September 6, 1976. Both were last seen alive at 10:30 p.m. the previous evening. The blood was still wet when the police arrived at 5:00 p.m. Despite the medical examiner's estimate that they died between 8:00 a.m. and 10:00 a.m. Therefore, they must have passed away later in the day. Both women were covered in dresses and had sustained severe beatings and multiple stab wounds. Blood was stained throughout the residence, indicating that the assailant, who was moving from room to room, also lost blood. Less than 24 hours prior, Joseph Sledge Jr., age 34, had just escaped from the nearby White Lake prison camp, leading the police to believe he was the suspect. Physical evidence did not establish a connection between Sledge and the crime. Despite not having changed his shoes since his release from jail, the shoes remained pristine and did not correspond with the bloody shoe prints discovered at the location. A verdict of innocence was rendered by a 3-judge panel of Superior Court judges in 2015, after an extended period of time had passed. For these offenses, he was sentenced to over 36 years in prison before being released. Sledge was subsequently compensated by the state of North Carolina with $750,000 for his unjust imprisonment. However, that sum is insufficient, and no amount of money could recoup the years he lost. Timothy Bridges. In this case, we will examine a similar incident involving Timothy Bridges, who spent 25 years in prison for a crime he did not commit, a burglary and rape, because an FBI-trained state hair analyst falsely testified that Bridges' hair matched 2 hairs discovered at the scene of the crime. The incident occurred between the afternoons of May 14th and May 15th, 1989, in North Charlotte. On May 15, 1989, her severely injured daughter-in-law discovered her house. The elderly, sick, and blind victim tragically passed away 13 months after the attack without providing a good description of her attacker, despite her denial that she had been raped. The doctor who treated her noted bruises consistent with a raid for a few months, and no one knew who committed the heinous crime. 3 informants, all of whom had criminal records, stated that Bridges told them he hadn't. Bridges has always maintained his innocence. Bridges has been residing with his family since obtaining his driver's license for the first time. His uncle even assisted him in purchasing a vehicle. However, he faces a considerable challenge in rebuilding his life following this heinous injustice. Eddie Bolton. A Chicagoan who had been jailed for over 2 decades on charges of murdering 2 men was released in 2016, after the charges were substantially reduced. Edward Bowden made his initial steps as an emancipated individual outside the Cook County Jail, where he had been sentenced to life in prison for the 1994 murders of Irving Clayton, age 23, and Derek Frazier, age 24. Upon their discovery, they were found dead inside of a vehicle. The police stated that the transaction involved an unsuccessful attempt to sell drugs. The testimony of one witness, Frazier's brother, that Balden was the shooter and that he was also injured in the shooting led to the conviction of Balden. This testimony was the basis for the conviction. However, an investigator later spoke with 3 people who testified under oath that they saw Balden playing an arcade game in a restaurant during the murders. Initially, the prosecutor stated that they would try Balden again, and he was being held on a $1 million bail. However, the investigator eventually realized that this individual had endured the shooting. Balden stated, "I knew freedom would eventually arrive. I just didn't know when." He believed it would take 22 years, but he still has life to live. Joe Lingan. For several decades, the United States has maintained the global record for the highest number of children sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Among all states, Pennsylvania has the highest number of young individuals incarcerated for life. It is unfortunate that Joe Lingan, the oldest juvenile in the country, has been incarcerated for the longest period of time. While the 83-year-old was incarcerated for offenses he committed at the tender age of 15, the son of Alabama sharecroppers was thrown into prison during the presidency of Dwight D. Eisenhower, and the song "Pretend" by Nat King Cole was popular on the Billboard 100. He now inhabits a world that has been altered. Lingan and 4 other black adolescents were implicated in a sequence of robberies and stabbings that resulted in the fatalities of 2 individuals in Philadelphia in 1953, an event that surpassed his comprehension. He acknowledges that he stabbed someone that night, but claims he did not kill anyone and has undergone a transformation in the intervening years. Lingan stated that he is contemplating his future and is considering applying for a job using the cleaning skills he gained in prison to clean the offices of the attorneys who assisted him in his release. Susan Marie Melan. After spending 17 years in prison for an offense she did not commit, Susan Marie Melan was finally released in 2014. On the basis of a witness's testimony that Melan orchestrated and carried out the murder of a homeless man named Richard Daley, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole following her trial. Superior Court Judge Mark Arnold stated that he believed the justice system had failed her. Arnold further stated that her attorney had not adequately represented her and that the woman who claimed to have heard Melan confess to the crime was a liar. In court documents obtained by the Associated Press, Mark Anthony of the Superior Court stated, "I believe she is innocent, and for that reason I believe the justice system failed in this case." Junie Patty, the eyewitness who claimed to have overheard Melan confess to the murder, had a history of providing false information to the police. However, by 2006, she had already passed away, and it is now that we know that 3 gang members were responsible for the crime that Melan remarkably stated that she is relieved justice has been served. Thomas Trantino. An American named Thomas Trantino was found to be responsible for the murders of 2 law enforcement officers in Lodi, New Jersey in the year 1963. For this, he received a death sentence. However, following the abolition of the death penalty in the 1970s, he was commuted to life in prison rather than receiving the chair. This marked the beginning of an arduous battle for parole, which lasted until his release in 2002. On August 26, 1963, in response to reports of unrest at the Angel Lounge on U.S. Route 46 in Lodi, Sergeant Peter Voto and P.O. Gary Tedesco were dispatched to investigate. Voto entered the bar without Tedesco, a probationary officer prohibited from carrying a firearm, and Frank Falco and Thomas Traiano, who were present to congratulate Voto on a successful robbery, attacked Tedesco when Voto returned outside. Tedesco entered the bar and was similarly taken aback. Both individuals were subjected to the same brutal torture and execution. Falco was fatally shot by officers of the New York City Police Department in Manhattan as he attempted to escape after hiding for 66 hours. Trantino turned himself in at the East 22nd Street station in Manhattan on August 28th, where he was subsequently arrested. Trantino was finally released from prison on February 11, 2002, after serving for 38 years. At the time of his release, he was the longest-serving prisoner in New Jersey. At this moment, ring the bell or a centipede will crawl on your face while you sleep. For the uncommon subject matter in the Soviet Union, punishments for crimes were typically death by exhaustion or severe labor. However, Andrew was considered fortunate in this case. A judge sentenced him to 87 years in prison without hard labor. The judge reportedly laughed, knowing that this was essentially a life sentence for the young Russian who was convicted of anti-communist activity. Christopher Abernathy. 15-year-old Christina Hickey, a resident of Park Forest, Illinois at the time, disappeared without a trace on October 3, 1984. The following day, while returning home from a high school choir performance, her remains were discovered concealed behind a shopping mall. It had been over a year since the incident that she had been raped and stabbed on November 30, 1985. Christopher Abernathy, who was 18 years old at the time, was detained for questioning subsequent to a friend Alan Dennis informating police that Abernathy had admitted to the murder of Mickey a few months prior to his arrest. Several hundred other teenagers had attended Mickey's funeral at that time, and Abernathy was overheard saying he had a firearm in his vehicle and intended to fire a salute after the funeral. The police examined Abernathy at that time, but concluded that the comment was not a major concern. After more than 40 hours of questioning, Abernathy, who had dropped out of high school and was suspected of having a learning disability, signed a confession. However, neither physical nor forensic evidence linked Abernathy to the crime, and the tests that were supposed to reveal the results of his sperm were negative. On January 15, 1987, Abernathy was found guilty by a jury of aggravated criminal sexual assault, first-degree murder, and armed robbery. At the tender of 17 years of age, Abernathy was spared the death penalty and instead received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Abernathy was convicted of a crime he did not commit and spent the majority of his life in prison. But in 2017, fresh DNA evidence established his innocence, and he was finally released. This case further prompts inquiries regarding instances of police coercion and similar circumstances. As we come to the end of this eye-opening journey, I urge you to reflect on the resilience of the human spirit. If you found this content intriguing, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more compelling stories. Remember, each click supports our channel in bringing you more fascinating narratives.